ICICI Bank. She was CEO of ICICI Securities and was one of ICICI Bank's famous petticoat brigade, the powerful quartet who ruled the world of Indian banking. She also happens to be intimately connected to some of the panelists here. One of them is her husband's boss. The other is her brother-in-law. So this must be like a cozy family chat for her actually. And finally, at the end of this thing, I mean, she used to run a very innovative CEO catwalk event in India when she was at ICICI. And I'm going to wait and see whether she asks those CEOs to do the same thing at the end of this session. So put your hands together for Madhvi, Harish, Piyush, Shankar and Sam.
It's just wonderful having all of you here on the panel. And I hope we're going to have some fun together. But to kick things off, I'd just like to start with a very simple request to each one of you to make a small address. Harish, if you'd like to go first, on what are your thoughts on global leadership, new frontiers, and the challenges facing people who are going to be looking at these two issues going forward. Over to you.
Okay, well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I must say that this makes me feel like I've gone back 40 odd years. When I sat in a group discussion in Hindustan, you really were surrounded by all these high people. The good news is, I'm here and so are they. And the only difference, of course, is that we never had 200 other people watching us. But there we go. Firstly, thank you very much for inviting me for this. I think it's a tremendous occasion. And all said and done, it says a lot about our country that's produced so many of you who are big leaders in our business. And I feel really privileged and honored that I'm sort of part of this, this August gathering. Let me start off by first talking about the kind of context in which we are all operating, all of us as businesses. Without a doubt, the new normal that we talk about now is the VUCA world. It's volatile, it's uncertain, it's complex, and it's ambiguous. And I think the changes, the rapid speed of change that we are seeing has never been like this before. So it's the new normal. We've got to live to the fact that the world tomorrow cannot be predicted on the basis of what it was yesterday. The second bit, which I think is really important, is that we live in an and world. It is no longer a world where, you can say, I'm going to do better, but be more expensive. You're going to be better and cheaper. There are risks and there are opportunities. There are, everything is all about developed world and the developing world. And it is in this world that a lot of us now have to operate. And the third bit, of course, which is really important, is that there is a crisis of trust in the world. And in this context, we've got to ask ourselves, what are the opportunities and not just the risks? And a lot of you, of course, are, I'm sure, familiar with some of the big mega trends we've seen around in our world. The first and the most important thing, of course, is the digital revolution. And the second bit is this whole shift from the west to the east and south, which is to the developing world. And the last bit, of course, is this whole issue about sustainability, the fact that all of us consume at the rate of 1.5 planets when we have only one. And the reason I mention these three big trends is because my definition of frontiers is not only a geographical definition. Of course, there are new frontiers. There is Africa, there is Myanmar, there is the entire developing world, which has 80% people and still only 30 to 35% who are in the middle class. That's an opportunity. But equally, there are frontiers of technology. Digital, for example, is redefining new industries, the kind of disruptions we've not seen before. Music industry is getting completely redefined. The book industry has got redefined. The way we communicate in the world around us has got redefined. And I think these are the new frontiers. The third big frontier, according to me, which is an opportunity and a risk, is the fact that anything that we do in this world has to be done responsibly. This whole model that all of us studied when we were in business schools, which is about managing our business sort of for shareholder value, I think that whole concept is changing. It's not about shareholder value alone. It's about shared values and it is about ensuring that the role of business in society remains relevant. You cannot have a successful business or a thriving business in a society that is sick or not doing well. And it is this, to my mind, which is the defining role of new leadership. So if I have to sum up and talk about really what I believe is going to be the role of leaders in this world, the first is managing reputation and trust. The trust of business leaders is an all-time low. And I do think that's the first responsibility of leaders. You do something wrong today, people know, the world knows tomorrow. The second is, how do you really make sure that there is a larger purpose that drives businesses and that your business is purpose-driven and values-led? You cannot be running a global operation and ensuring that you do it through financial controls. That the glue that holds companies together is a common purpose and, importantly, a common set of values. The third bit, and I think this is important, that the whole concept of followership is changing. It is no longer about commitment of our people. It is no longer about loyalty of our people. I mean, some of us are oddballs. I've only worked in Unilever. That doesn't make me anything special. But the fact that you can get commitment of your people, it's not about loyalty, it's about commitment. The fourth bit is about creating a learning organization. Experience does not make great teachers anymore. The world is changing too rapidly for that. And creating a learning organization is critical. And to my mind, the last and the most important thing about leaders of today who are going to succeed are people who are going to surround themselves with people that are bigger than themselves. Because in this changing world, what you constantly know is that someone out there is a little better than you. And have the confidence to surround yourself with leaders bigger than you. And I hope today that's what I am doing. So with that, over to you.
So first of all, the honest confession is I'm the brother-in-law of Audrey's. So I was persuaded by her to be over here. You can figure this is she's a good persuader. Right, so I feel like I'm back in business school and having to get my 2 penny bits in for class participation marks. Except that Harish has said everything I want to say. I do want a couple of things. First, I think this notion of what are new frontiers, I couldn't agree more with Harish. And I think fundamentally the new way of doing things, the new way of life is really the ultimate new frontier. And if you think about new frontiers in that way, it's kind of difficult to quote unquote prepare for new frontiers. Change is constant. Leading organizations to be able to adapt to change is what all leaders need to do. So let me go on with this thing. So what do leaders need to do? And everybody has their favorite list of things. But to my mind, in this constantly changing world, there are really 3 important things which I think is incumbent on leaders to be able to do to lead their organizations effectively. The first is this whole issue of creating a vision, a sense of direction. I think that's probably one of the most important things that leaders have to do. Point the organization to a single true north. And not only point the organization to true north, but to create energy in the organization so everybody is aligned towards the single true north. It's not easy to do. For the leader, you have to be able to bring the outside in as much as you take the inside out. Relating the market, relating to external environment, relating to stakeholder society, and in that context figuring out where should you want to take this company and how do you excite people, how do you create a sense of curiosity to reach out, to embrace new things. That's crucially important. I liken it sometimes to actually being the captain of a ship. Think about Christopher Columbus. The notion that you want to go to India via the west, you need somebody who charts that. There will be a bunch of different things you have to do along the way, but you'll be able to create that sense of mission, that sense of enterprise, and the sense of wanting to achieve. I call that number 1. The second big agenda for a leader is the issue of creating organizational capacity. And organizational capacity is a bunch of things. It's about talent. finding the right people. It's about core competencies, making sure you have the appropriate skill sets. But there is one part of the capacity which I believe is very important, and that is culture. So the notion of creating organization culture, which in my mind is, I often think of it as the hidden hand. Right? This is sort of like Adam Smith. But it is the moral compass, the moral fabric that guides organizations. And when you're in the process of change, if you're addressing new frontiers, you have to have an organization which is guided by a good moral compass, where people in different parts of the organization, different situations, can all figure out that they're doing the right thing. And they're doing the right thing because it is in line with the set of behaviors, the set of values, and the set of expectations that you collectively want to embrace. So this thing about culture and driving organizational culture to me is crucial and a critical part of the capacity building issue. The third thing to me, and this is particularly true when you're thinking about taking organizations in new directions, is an issue of what I call moral courage. It is very easy to get swept away in companies with addressing short-term agendas. In fact, that is what we're all paid to do. Shareholder value, the tyranny of the quarterly number, getting the stock price up. There are a lot of demands on organizations' interest and time. The capacity and the tenacity to stay the course and think long-term. The willingness to be able to chart a course and withstand pressures to the contrary. That calls for moral courage. Doing, like I said, the right thing, but doing it consistently and sustained. Now, you have to build it in the organization, but at the end of the day, the company is always looking at the leader to be able to demonstrate the capacity to do that in the long term. So I think these are three things to my mind: setting the direction, building capacity, and creating the sense of moral courage in companies, which is really important for global leaders to be able to strive for.
Thank you.
Following Harish Bhagwani, if you felt you were engaging in a bit of class participation, following both of you, I feel like Elizabeth Taylor's seventh husband. Harish talked about volatility. And I think the biggest challenge with volatility today is extreme events happen, unexpected events happen far more often. And it is happening in a very globalized environment. So I think a very important challenge for all of us as leaders in companies today, whether you're leaders, entrepreneurs, whatever, is about having a global mindset. I think it's very important. The other challenge I think that most companies face is we are so internally focused, we have forgotten that the raison d'etre of our existence is really the clients and customers. I think more and more companies are getting very inwardly focused, and I think that's a challenge everybody faces. Again, in terms of the external environment, Harish and Piyush talked about globalization and the forces of volatility. But another one, I think, is general social expectations have arisen. The gap between the haves and the have-nots have magnified. Which is why I think increasingly the dialogue needs to be about inclusive capitalism. All of us were brought up believing that if we grow the GDP, somehow there will be a trickle down and the people at the bottom of the pyramid will make a good living. But what the events of recent times have taught us is that is not working. You not only need to look at the quantity of growth, but also the quality of growth. You not only need to look at the pace of growth, but also the pattern of growth. And if you look at where I'm based today, the Middle East, the Arab Spring comes to mind. At the end of the day, the Arab Spring is about youth unemployment and a lot of people feeling disenfranchised. And if you talk today to the person in Tahrir Square in Cairo or Misrata in Libya, he would tell you 2 years after the Arab Spring, his life is no better. The Arab Spring has been followed by a summer of dashed hopes, followed by an autumn of disappointment, and is probably going to lead to a long winter of discontent. And we are in a world where increasingly companies need to focus on creating employment and being more responsible partners in communities. They also need, as leaders, to embrace diversity. And I think we Indians are very used to diversity because we are a country of multiple caste, creed, color, customs, costumes, cuisines, consonants. So diversity is a very natural thing for Indians, and it's something which is going to be a huge attribute for companies as we explore new frontiers. New frontiers, to my mind, is one aspect of it is the growing South-South trade, which today is 1/3 of global trade and growing twice as fast as the traditional North-South trade. There's another aspect to it which is beyond India and China, which I think increasingly is about connecting Asia, Latin America, the Middle East through to Latin America, and the important role that Africa will play in all our lives in the next 30, 40 years. I'll just stop there.
Good evening, everybody. Being the fourth in this panel, my advantage is I can say that I agree with every word that Harish, Piyush, and Shankar has spoken, and leave it at that. I'll spare you all some additional observations, but I'm sure Madhvi will not allow me to do that. And also, having known the interested parties, given the self-declarations that have been made, I regret not having engaged Madhvi earlier today and softened her up to throw some gentle questions at me. But if you really going to get nasty with us today, I suggest that you focus on Shankar's and Piyush's salaries, which will be more interesting to the audience, and not so much money voters. Delighted to be with this panel this evening. And I think since the panel's topic is about the role of leaders in exploring new frontiers, I'll just sort of focus on our experience in exploring new frontiers for our business, which is Olam. For those of you who don't know, Olam is actually a Hebrew word which means transcending boundaries and therefore crossing frontiers. And for us, there were three objectives when we looked at growing our franchise across geographical boundaries of frontiers or even across product boundaries of frontiers. And those three objectives was, one, we were looking to seek new resources or seeking new sources of supply. So for example, we wanted to get into the almond business as part of our edible nuts platform. And almonds can only be grown in 4 countries around the world. California produces 80% of the world's almonds. So we went into California. Australia is the second largest producer of almonds. We went in there. So today we are the second largest almond orchard owner. But seeking to go into California or to Australia was really seeking new sources of supply and controlling or getting access to those resources. The second objective that we pursued in terms of going overseas or expanding into new frontiers was seeking efficiencies. So we wanted to get into coffee plantations. We found that the marginal cost producer of coffee was Brazil. It produces Arabica coffee at about $1.30 a pound. We looked around all the other producing countries, looked at the costs, capital and cash cost of production, and found that in 4 countries, we could produce that coffee cheaper than Brazil's cost of production. Which means in a deep down cycle in commodity prices, the typical rule is that the prices don't go below the marginal cost producer's cost of production. So we went into Laos and Southeast Asia, where we could produce that coffee at 65 cents, into Zambia, where we could produce that coffee at 55 cents, into Tanzania and Ethiopia, where we could produce that coffee at 75 cents. The third objective of crossing frontiers was basically new market seeking. So when we went into set up an office in Algeria, because in the North African world, coffee consumption was growing, coffee consumption culture was growing. That is an example of going and crossing a frontier because you wanted to seek new markets. So these were the three objectives. So today we are in 16 platforms, 65 countries. And the logic that drove us to go into these new platforms is to seek what we call adjacent business opportunities. Opportunities that was very closely related to a core business. So as I mentioned in the edible nuts platform, we started with the cashew business as the first product. Then we migrated into peanuts, then into almonds, then into hazelnuts. Because the same set of customers who were consuming cashews, the salters and roasters, they were the same set of guys who were buying peanuts and almonds and hazelnuts. And going forward, we'll get into pecans and macadamia nuts and pine nuts and walnuts and pistachios. So there's a natural, reflexive, routine way of growing by going into these adjacent businesses where there's customer sharing, or cost sharing, or channel sharing, or capability sharing. And the critical thing to successfully grow into new frontiers is first and foremost, the mantra has to be you have to have some differentiation or edge before you scale. You cannot contemplate going into new frontiers if you've not created some edge, some angle, some differentiation. The second is you need a core team of a deep bench strength of people who have a global mindset, who have a bicultural sensitivity. So for example, anybody who joins OLAM in our global assignee talent pool have to necessarily go and live and work in very tough geographies for 3 or 4 years, so that they understand the risks and they know deep personal contact and experience how to manage those risks. And they therefore imbibe our DNA. They know our business model inside out, our risk management systems, our control systems, share our values and culture. So whenever we go into a new frontier, the critical mass of these guys have to be available to make that happen. And I'll just conclude with 3 lessons that we have learned. The first one was differentiate before you scale. The second was there's a huge difference. We live in an insight deficit world, but a knowledge surplus world. We are in a Google era. Anything we want to know about any country that you're entering or any product market that you're entering, you can Google and find information on that and get knowledge on that. But that's a big difference between knowledge and insight. And unless you convert knowledge into insight, it's useless. And that can only come from seeing the patterns and connecting the dots and all of that stuff. And that's the second thing. You have to derive insight, and the leader has to derive insight. And the final issue is best practice is often lousy strategy. A lot of us are in this room thinking that the 4 of us will give some value add to this evening's occasion. But really, best practice, everybody is looking at best practice. If you want to succeed and grow profitably, if you follow best practice, at best you're middle of the pack, you're average. You have to innovate and look at adapting best practice and making it next practice to succeed.
I'm going to request the panel to actually move quite far away from what they've done so far. They've been talking to us about their companies and the strategies that they believe that large leading corporates need to follow, and take them on a journey which is a very personal journey. So each one of you, if you look back the last 30 years and you say that you were a youngster, a management trainee perhaps.
30 years, Sunny wasn't even born.
But he's in that August company. We'll pardon him for his age. So in your personal journeys, we're very keen to know that as you migrated and transitioned from being management trainees to local leaders, to regional leaders, and now global leaders, what is it that you have seen as being a significant change in the way that you are? And how is it that people have seen this change? So if somebody were to say that there was an adjective that the people used to describe you many, many years ago, and there are a different set of adjectives that people use to describe you today. So what would it be that people have dropped? What have you stopped being? And what have you started being in your own personal journey of becoming a global leader? And I'll start with Shankar.
The adjective, I think, was very simple. I think 30 years ago, 20 years ago, people used to describe me as a pain in the ass. I think they brought the pain, but they just called me an ass. The bit on, journey. Look, I was born in India, I was brought up in India. I had traveled abroad when I graduated from IIM. We are all products of the neighborhood we are born in and the stuff that we're exposed to. This was an age where you didn't have the internet, you didn't have the television in India was basically, you had 2 channels on Doordarshan. One showed you high-yielding varieties of rice and the other one showed you high-yielding varieties of wheat. So naturally, you are pretty limited in terms of your ambition and your aspiration. And you have to obviously adapt, adopt, assimilate, absorb as you go out. And then I had the opportunity to leave India in '89, haven't been back there since, although I traveled very much back there. So what are the key things which I've learned on this journey? One is, obviously, if you have to become a global, be on the global stage, you need to get culturally flexible. That is very important. When you start off life as a management trainee, I guess most of us got hired, not me, but most of us got hired for IQ. But later on in life, I think EQ matters, emotional intelligence matters more than IQ. And also when you start off at the bottom of the pyramid, you necessarily needs to be far more hands-on, and that's what gets you the praise. But as you get more senior, you need to know very much when to swoop and when to soar. Leaders can't just afford to operate at 30,000 feet and refuse to get hands-on, and nor can you just get lost in the weeds. So to me, those would be the major things that I have learned along the course. But I still remain an ass.
I have to say this to Sunny after his thing about my compensation. People who are bathing in muddy water, Sunny, can't afford to get any person.
Piyush, I think TPM defended you earlier in the evening. He said it's not about cost, it's about value.
You know, I'm not sure what people describe me. I have friends here from the young days who probably do a better job of putting an adjective to me. But let me tell you a couple of things which changed over the year. At least I figured it out. I think Shankar talked about it. This thing about cultural sensitivity, context, and being able to figure and operate in multiple environments, that's hugely important. I tell a lot of people who come from India, my general thing is about 50% of Indians succeed, 50% fail. The ones who fail are because of the EQ issue. They just don't get being able to handle different cultures and different people, not because of the IQ issue. So that's an obvious one. The second thing which I learned over time is this whole issue around communication. Communication is misunderstood. Indians generally talk well, they articulate, they can get their point across. The issue is less what you're trying to do in terms of output. It's really focusing on what is the input, what are people understanding of what you're trying to communicate. And over time you recognize that the art of communication is often to do with the cultural differences, but it is often to do with the form, not just the substance. So to me, this learning that form matters. McLuhan said, the medium is the message. Form matters. How do you package what you want to communicate? How do you manage to communicate it successively, repetitively? How do you communicate in a way that gets to different levels in organizations and companies? And how do you communicate in a way that different people with different contexts and different backgrounds still carry away the same sense of meaning? That's not easy to do. And over the years, I figured that this ability to communicate differently in a nuanced and contextualized way is a big differentiator. So it's one way in which I think I'm very different today than I used to be. The other is an issue which I think Harish talked about before. I think it's particularly true for people who've grown in the Indian environment. This whole focus on shareholder or my business context or what I need to do and what I need to do to get ahead. Life doesn't work like that, and particularly as in today's world, in the new world. You just have to be thinking of multiple stakeholders. You have to be thinking of employees as well as you think of customers. You have to be thinking of societies. You have to be thinking of governments. You have to be thinking of the yin and yang and balancing them. And that's something which actually doesn't come naturally and automatically to a lot of people who've grown and have their roots in the Indian business environment and the business context. That's the other thing which I think I learned over time, that you just have to think about quite differently from the way I did when I was growing up.
Well, in this question, of course, I can't say I agree and shut up, so I have to give you my own perspective. I I still go back to when I got recruited as a management trainee to Hindustan Lever, and there were many other colleagues, like some of them sitting here, who joined banks. So I think the descriptor always was that I was always going to be underpaid and overworked. And I still think that that's what I am. Underpaid and overworked. That hasn't changed. I think a couple of other things haven't changed. And I think when you're brought up in India, one of the things that you actually take for granted is the enormous amount of diversity that you work with all the time. And it's cultural diversity, it's gender. Well, gender diversity probably is one of the big issues that we have. But there is a lot of diversity, and fortunately, right from a very early stage in our life, we are used to it. And I think that helps. My own learnings, as I've sort of traveled across the world and worked in many cultures, and I've been privileged again with Unilever to have worked in different parts from Asia to Europe to North America to Latin America. And part of my responsibilities has been Africa. So I've been fortunate actually to go all over. And very early you discover a couple of things. People aren't as different as you think they are. The motivation of people to deliver big things is not very different. And the second thing you discover is that the best version of you is yourself. In other words, be authentic. I can tell you my most difficult leadership moments was not when I was the president of a region, or when I'm a CEO of a global business now. My most difficult moments were when I was coming out of business school and I was put in as an area sales manager, where I was responsible for a bunch of people, salespeople, who were all older than me, as old as my father, and I had to learn how to manage them, not by management by objectives. It was all about managing them as human beings, and that's where you learn that it is not just about roles, it's about building relationships. Very early you realize that that's what keeps you going. When I first went in as perhaps one of the biggest breaks I got in Unilever, as the president for our Latin America business, I had the same situation. Half the people who were running our companies there were people who were 2 generations removed from what I am. And the idea was that I had to be myself. The other thing you discover is it doesn't matter how old people are, how senior they are, how experienced they are. People respond to a sense of destination. People respond to that authenticity that you can bring. Ultimately, what you need is to build those relationships, but you build it around a coherent destination. People love going for something big. Creating those big, hairy, audacious goals actually matters. And the last bit I would say here, because we can go on and on this one, is that when you are actually looking at your work, you have 2 choices. You can keep looking where you're going to be tomorrow, or you can say, I'm going to be here and now. And the other thing that I have learned, and this is true when I joined the company, and it's true now, that you have to live in the here and now. Do what you have to do today, and believe me, the journey can be endless and long and fun and successful. So those are the few messages here.
And probably embarrassing to try and provide adjectives that others would say about you. And I'm sure if I ask the people who know me in this room, we'll hear a few kind adjectives, but a few colorful ones as well. So I'd probably just try and focus on what changes I have gone through in my leadership journey so far. And the first is, I think, I've had 2 forming experiences in my career. One was the stint I had with HLL, now Hindustan Unilever, which was my first job. Spent 4.5 years there. And it gave me a lot of confidence about really how to manage a business well. Whether it's about planning an organization, planning and budgeting, or organizing and staffing, or reviewing and controlling your businesses. So the first transition that I've had is moving from being a manager to